Merry Christmas, motherfuckers! We're talking about The Legend of Zelda. Specifically, I want to talk about the new one, Hyrule Warriors, Age of Calamity, because it has one of the most confusing and frustrating stories of any of the Zelda games. This game, of course, is the prequel spin-off to Breath of the Wild that tells the story of what happened right before the events of Breath of the Wild. Kind of. We're going to get into it, but if you haven't played it before, I recommend that you do, because you might think, oh, well, the backstory to Breath of the Wild. I've played Breath of the Wild, I know more or less what happens, so I know basically what happens in that game. Wrong. There's more to it, which is what we're going to get into. And we're also going to talk about the Zelda Timeline as a whole, which is a whole big mess in and of itself. So we're also going to spoil all of these games, so go play those, I guess. But yeah, let's get into the Legend of fucking Zelda.
It's the Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda. Awesome. Intense.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. Your parents help you hook it up.
So, the Legend of Zelda Timeline is a big, complicated mess, because depending on the game and the era, Nintendo either does or doesn't care about the continuity between the different Zelda games and how they're all connected. The one thing that is cool about the series is that you can pretty much play any of the games, and they stand alone by themselves fairly well. So you don't really need to know all this shit, but if you're curious about how all the games are connected, that's what we're gonna go into. So the first couple Zelda games, Zelda and Zelda 2 on the NES, the story of it all was pretty simple and wasn't very fleshed out. There's a princess you gotta save and stop the bad guy. And that's about it. Link to the Past on Super Nintendo kind of followed in the same formula. They kind of reimagined stuff from the first game and fleshed out the world and characters a little more. Still a pretty straightforward thing with not a whole lot going on. Then we get into the big boys, Ocarina of Time. I know it looks small, but trust me, it's there. Kablam. So Ocarina of Time comes out. Big deal, everyone loves it, critical acclaim, blah blah blah. It's also the most important game in the Zelda timeline. And the reason is that it has time travel in it, which is something the Zelda franchise likes to do every now and then. So a few years later, Wind Waker comes out for the GameCube, and everyone hates it initially because the graphics are super cartoony. It's very different from Ocarina of Time. It has a totally different art style and does something totally different than all the previous games. Now, people did eventually grow to love Wind Waker, and now it's considered one of the best of the series. But at the time, people were really upset that they were doing this cartoony art style. Nintendo did kind of shoot themselves in the foot with this one, because a year or two earlier, they had this tech demo of what a Zelda game might look like on the GameCube, with the Ocarina designs of Link and Ganondorf fighting, but with updated GameCube graphics. And so people assumed oh, okay, that's what we're gonna get, is what similar to Ocarina of Time, but updated graphics, and it'll be dark and serious and cool. And then Nintendo's nah, we're doing something totally different, and people got upset. The other thing I should mention about Wind Waker is that, although it's sort of its own thing, it does eventually make specific references to Ocarina of Time. We find out at that game that after you defeat Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, eventually he came back, and in order to stop him, the goddesses, I want to say it's the goddesses, flooded all of Hyrule, and that's why that game takes place in an ocean. But it is definitely a sequel to the events of Ocarina of Time. So we're gonna put that there for now, but just keep it in mind. Although people eventually grew to love Wind Waker, initially they were kind of not huge fans that it was really cartoony and had this different art style and took things in a different direction. So a few years after that we got Twilight Princess, which is probably the edgiest of any of the Zelda games. Yeah, so initially people were very excited for this one because they were doing classic Zelda again. It was like Nintendo was listening to their angry fans. They're like, oh, okay, we'll do the thing that you like. And so Twilight Princess is again, a follow-up to the events of Ocarina of Time. They make several references to the fact that it's a follow-up to the events of Ocarina of Time. And we get a very similar looking Hyrule. We see the Gorons and the Zora again. Ganondorf comes back, and It's just like how it was in Ocarina. The Zelda franchise also comes sort of in weird waves, like where people sometimes don't really like whatever the newest game is at first, but then over time, once it becomes nostalgic, then people like it again. So like with Twilight Princess, they're like, remember Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the games you like? And people are like, yeah, I love those games. And so initially I think people really liked this one, and then after a while I think people were kind of like, actually Wind Waker was really cool, and this game's kind of just like dark for the sake of being dark, unlike Majora's Mask, which is a game that I don't even particularly like that much, but I think has a lot of really, really interesting dark themes and characters that all inform the story and aren't just there for the sake of it being dark and edgy, which is sort of my problem with Twilight Princess. I actually agree with PBG's old sentiment about Twilight Princess.
It tried way too hard to be dark, but it wasn't dark in a unique way. It was dark in a just blackish kind of way. Where are the colors?
I know that PBG has since retracted this statement, saying that he was too harsh on Twilight Princess, but I actually kind of agree with a lot of his points about how the game tries too hard to be dark. Like, look at this dream sequence here. Like, yeah, it's dark, but like, what the fuck even is this? Like, what is happening? It also, for me, does so much of like, hey, remember Ocarina of Time? Remember Ganondorf? Remember hitting the thing like before? Remember Epona? Remember the Gorons? Remember literally the Link from Ocarina of Time? Remember him? He's in this game! I'm not a huge fan of Twilight Princess, but again, it's become nostalgic for a lot of people, so people are kind of into it again. And I think there's a lot of elements that are good about the game. Midna, the best supporting character of any of the Zelda games, as well as a lot of the stuff they do with Zant, I think is really interesting and unique. But I feel like instead of really embracing the ideas that are unique to this game, they kind of fall back on a lot of, hey, remember Ocarina of Time? This also puts us in a weird situation here, because both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess kind of establish that they're both direct sequels to the Ocarina of Majora's Mask Link. But obviously these games can't like both exist at the same time, because the Hyrule in both these games is completely different. It's totally flooded in Wind Waker. So like, is there some time between that we are missing? How does any of that work? And the answer eventually does come in the form of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. This game, Nintendo decides that, actually, yeah, we do care about the story of the Zelda series, and we do care about how all the games are connected, and we're going to explain how they're all connected by showing you the first game in the timeline, which is this one, and show you the origins of the Master Sword, Ganondorf, Hyrule, kind of all of it. So Skyward Sword goes at the beginning of the timeline. And this is where we actually finally explain how the timeline works. They give you this whole book that explains everything. It's all in here. You have to read a whole textbook to understand how this franchise works. It's great. I bought it. So in Skyward Sword, they established that Ganondorf is the reincarnation of this demon king called Demise. And at the end of Skyward Sword, when you defeat him, he curses the spirit of the hero and the blood of the goddess, so that wherever they show up in history, he will haunt them and come back. And so the idea that they established basically is that all the Links are the reincarnations of the original Link from this game. And Zelda is a similar kind of thing, except that she's also magic. She is the blood of the goddess Hylia, the goddess who created the world of Hyrule. So she's kind of like a Jesus figure, where she's like the goddess in human form, sort of. And then so her descendants have the royal blood of the goddess, which is why they're in charge. And so all the other Zeldas are descendants of the original Zelda, and they literally have royal blood because it's the blood of the goddess, the creator of the universe. So it's sort of like what England believes about their royal family, but real. And it's the same idea where they're all called Zelda because it's the traditional name of the daughters of fucking royal family. It's like how there's 100 King Georges and King Henrys and stuff. They just don't really keep track of which number of Zelda it is. And then Link, it's like all the other Links are his past lives. So they explain in the timeline here that Skyward Sword, then there's a couple games like Minish Cap or whatever, and then Ocarina of Time, the big one, where Ganondorf shows up again. And what's kind of cool about him is that although the Links and Zeldas are all different, they're like past lives of the previous ones or whatever, but it's the same Ganondorf in all the games. He just gets sealed away in the Sacred Realm or the Twilight Realm or the whatever I can never remember realm. But whenever he comes back, he like remembers all the other times you defeated him, which is kind of interesting. So because Ocarina of Time has time travel, this is where they're like, okay, here's our chance to explain how these games are both a sequel to Ocarina. So at the end of Ocarina of Time, you defeat Ganondorf as an adult, and then you go back in time to when you were a kid, and then you stop him from even taking over, and then you go and do Majora's Mask, and then from that timeline, eventually, like, Twilight Princess happens. But what about the timeline where you were an adult? In that timeline, you've defeated Ganondorf or whatever, but then Link fucks off and goes back in time and does Majora's Mask. So there's just, like, a timeline where Ganondorf is defeated, but Link is he's just gone, because he's now in a different timeline. He's doing his own thing. So eventually, in that timeline, when Ganondorf does come back, there's no Link to stop him. So in order to stop him, the goddesses flood all of Hyrule, and that's where we get the Wind Waker timeline. Now, but wait a minute, what about all the earlier games? The first couple of Zeldas on the NES, Link to the Past, the Oracle games, Link's Egg Volcano, where does this go? And the answer to that, because a lot of these games didn't really focus too much on story, Nintendo's like, I don't know where to fucking put them. So what they do instead is create, oh no, stay. They create a third timeline, which is an alternate timeline in which at some point in Ocarina of Time, Link fails. Link doesn't save Hyrule, and it gets completely taken over by Ganondorf. And then eventually you get Link to the Past, Egg Volcano, and all those other ones. Stuff like Link Between Worlds also goes over here, which is another follow-up to Link to the Past. And then the original Zeldas are at the bottom somewhere. And that's sort of the way they explain all these games where they couldn't figure out where they go, is that there's an alternate path if you fail at some point in Ocarina of Time. That leads to all these other games happening, which is an interesting idea, one which they will probably never explore any further. And that's basically the Zelda timeline. But, of course, it's Nintendo, so things have to get more complicated and more convoluted. Because a few years later, a new Zelda game comes out called Breath of the Wild. This game's great, critically acclaimed, everyone loves it, blah blah blah. The thing about this one, although it's just one major console Zelda away from Skyward Sword, when they're like, we care about the timeline and we want to explain how this all works, they don't care about it anymore. The focus with this one is less on story and more on exploration, despite what the trailers would make you think. In a lot of ways, this game is a conceptual remake of the first game. It's this barren Hyrule with hardly any civilization left. You can do all the main stuff in pretty much any order. It's completely open world. There's all these different caves or shrines that you visit and find interesting things. Story isn't really a big element of this game. When it was first coming out, there was all these like really hype story trailers that got me like super jazzed for whatever story that it was going to end up telling. And then when you play the game, it's like, oh yeah, the story does not matter whatsoever. It's literally just explore this big open world. You have to defeat Ganon. That's it. Now, there is, like, story stuff in the game. Throughout the game, you could collect all these flashback memories to 100 years ago when there was this great war. But because you can everything's so open world and non-linear, you can collect these memories in any order. So you don't really get a good sense of, like, what happened before the start of this game. Like, yeah, you can rewatch all the cutscenes once you've collected all of them, but, like, who really wants to do that? This is also the first time that a Zelda game has introduced voice acting, so it was like, it felt like it was going to be like a big deal story-wise, where they were like, oh yeah, we're actually taking steps to focus more on story this time, unlike all the other ones, except for Skyward Sword, the one game where they actually cared about the story. Although there was, like, elements that seemed like Nintendo really was interested in telling this like big epic story with these different characters and stuff. At the same time, they were like, nah, we don't care at all. It was also, again, strange because it was unclear where this game took place in the overall timeline. We see both the Rito and the Koroks races, which we'd never seen outside of the Wind Waker timeline before, as well as the Gorons and the Zoras, the guys that we'd seen in these timelines over here. So, which one of these does it fit in? Is it before somehow? That doesn't sound right, because it also has specific references to games from pretty much all of the different timelines. So it was very unclear where exactly this was supposed to go. And because Nintendo was like less interested in the story and more interested in the elements of exploration and stuff, they seemed kind of hesitant to tell us where it went canonically as well. Until eventually they're just like, it goes at the end of the timeline. And Zelda fans were like, okay, but like which timeline? There's 3. And Nintendo was like, yes, that's right. The canonical placement of Breath of the Wild, is that still in frame? Is that at some point, okay, all of the timelines converge, and Breath of the Wild is at the very end. But that's not how timelines fucking work. Nintendo's just like, deal with it. We don't care. You figure this shit out. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the first Hyrule Warriors. This is a spin-off game developed by a different studio, people behind the Dynasty Warriors series, and it's this big like action hack and slash game, and it's pretty fun. Although it's technically not canon, I don't think. It's worth mentioning because, of course, the team behind this game would go on to produce the one we're gonna get into eventually, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, which is the prequel to Breath of the Wild. This game, of course, is not really canon, but the way that they justify including characters from all the different timelines and stuff, and having it make some kind of sense, is they introduce time travel, of course. And so that's how you get to meet characters from Skyward Sword and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and stuff, and have it all be within the same storyline. There's also some ideas in this that kind of carry over into Breath of the Wild, the idea of like Link being part of the royal guard, the cool blue scarf he has in this one, the blue kind of carries over into Breath of the Wild. Little aesthetic things like that, as well as taking elements from all of the previous Zelda games and kind of mashing them together. But it's also the only thing that would plausibly explain how the hell Breath of the Wild is at the end of all of the timelines. Brian David Gilbert talks about this in his Zelda Timeline video, which is mostly a joke and includes Zelda Monopoly as the linchpin of the entire franchise.
Reggie, take fucking notes! I just saved your ass with Monopoly!
But I think there is some validity to the theory that Hyrule Warriors, this weird kind of dumb spin-off game, being the only thing that can explain how all of the timelines could somehow converge into one timeline, which leads us to Breath of the Wild. So I'm gonna put it on here, just kind of to the side slightly, but. And then that, of course, brings us to Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Follow-up to the first Hyrule Warriors that acts as a canonical prequel to Breath of the Wild. This is words from Nintendo, okay? In all the marketing, they're like, see the story that happened 100 years before Breath of the Wild. And I was super hyped for this game. I got it the day it came out. I've spent probably close to 60 hours in it. It's fun. That's the main thing to take away from this, if anything, is that I think this game is very fun. It takes the core elements from the first Hyrule Warriors and expands on them and makes and fleshes them out a lot more. In the first game, there was a lot more mashing buttons, but in this one, there's a little more strategy involved in the combat. They take a lot of ideas from Breath of the Wild. The different Sheikah runes play a part when you're fighting enemies. You also have different elemental attacks that work on different elemental enemies in sort of a Pokemon rock, paper, scissors kind of way, but it also depends on like the environment you're in. If you shoot lightning at someone while they're over water, they're gonna get like extra lightning damage done to them. Stuff like that I think is really fun and keeps things interesting. But okay, so like let's get into the story of this game, because that's the thing I want to talk about. So all the marketing is like, this is the story of 100 years before Breath of the Wild, find out what happened and all that stuff, which like, don't you arguably get some of that in Breath of the Wild? Yes, but they don't flesh it out very much, and it's not a huge part of the game. And like I said before, even if you do get all the memories, you're probably going to get them in a random order because the game is non-linear, so that you don't really see the story unfold in a traditional sense. And even when you do get all of them, it still feels like there's a large portion of the story that you've just haven't seen. So I was really hyped for this game to actually finally get to see that backstory that was like teased in from Breath of the Wild. All the voice actors are back. I think it's a really smart move. They're allowed to tell a canonical story in the Zelda franchise, but using the Hyrule Warriors gameplay mechanics, and in a way that justifiably makes sense, because 100 years ago there was this great big war that destroyed all of Hyrule, and that sounds cool to see that actually unfold. And I wanted to learn more about the champions. These 4 characters, who some of which are kind of generic. Daruk is essentially the same as Darunia from Ocarina. Revali is just Falco. Urbosa has this kind of interesting relationship with Zelda because she was good friends with her mother who died. And Mipha has this like kind of cute crush on Link, and her whole story in Breath of the Wild is kind of interesting because she's got this cool brother Sidon who's really fun, and this old guy doesn't like you because he's a racist. And it's the most interesting of any of the different storylines in Breath of the Wild, and I think at least. So I was really kind of excited to learn more about these characters and to see them assemble and go on this grand adventure, and we kind of get that in this a little bit. The first chunk of the game is exactly how you would expect it to be. Link and Zelda assemble the 4 champions, and we get to see them go on this quest to learn about the Guardians and the big robot things, and try to figure out how to stop Ganondorf from rising, because I know he's coming back. And then as Ganondorf comes back and things start to fall apart, and you're like, oh shit, we're like getting into the stuff from the game. This is kind of crazy. Champions are all under attack. It looks like they're gonna die, like we know they did from Breath of the Wild. And then what? Oh, a fucking portal opens up, and look who it is. It's all the new champions from Breath of the Wild. They're here. They're in this game from 100 years in the future. It's Sidon and the other ones. That's right, this game is fucking time travel in it. So, and then it diverges from the backstory to Breath of the Wild. So it's kind of a prequel to Breath of the Wild, but it kind of also goes over here to become its own thing, separate from the other timelines. And then you win. Then with the help of these other guys from the future, you win. You get to win. You get to defeat Ganondorf and save the day. Yay! But also, what the fuck? This game promised that it would tell the canonical story of what happened before Breath of the Wild, and then halfway through the game they're like, fuck you, never mind, we're doing our own thing, because look at how sexy Sidon is. He's so cute. Maybe he's not Doug Jones level sexy, but he's pretty close. And don't you want to play as him? Like, sure. And also, wouldn't it be fun to win the game? It'd be kind of sad if you lost. It's like, okay, yes, I guess that'd be fun. But also, like, I assumed we would lose, because I played Breath of the Wild and I know what happens. So, like, I kind of get why they did this. One, Hyrule Warriors is a series about getting the chance to play as all these different characters that hadn't previously been playable in the Zelda series before. And like, yeah, you're going to make one that's like a spin-off of Breath of the Wild and not include some of the major characters from Breath of the Wild. That seems like a missed opportunity. So I get it. And at the same time, isn't it kind of fun to see like a slightly different story unfold so that there's twists and turns and you don't know what's going to happen? Like, yeah, that's also fun. And like, if like some of the main characters died partway through the game, you want to get to play as them in all these like side missions and stuff. The choices of which characters the player gets to play as would be diminished over the course of the game. Like, yeah, I guess that's all true and stuff. And like when I was playing through the game, I was really into it. I was like really curious where this fucking story was going because I no longer knew what was gonna happen. You team up with Master Koga, this ninja guy who's like a boss that you fight in Breath of the Wild. But he like joins the good guys at one point, and it's like kind of cool and fun. And yeah, all these things are interesting for sure. But at the same time, I kind of feel like I got cheated because I didn't get the backstory of Breath of the Wild that I was promised. So although we have like a huge amount of content of like fully voice acted cutscenes of like stuff that happened before Breath of the Wild, I still feel like we really haven't gotten that storyline. Call me crazy, but I thought it might be kind of fun to play like a Halo Reach style game where you lose. Like, wouldn't it be interesting and cool if the last level... Like the last level had you just there in Hateno, in that Guardian Graveyard area from Breath of the Wild, and you're just fighting Guardians until you die, until you lose. I think that would be kind of cool. I want to see that. I want to see the promise of that Breath of the Wild trailer fulfilled. Because it's such a fucking hype trailer. Now, it may be unfair to criticize a game for what it isn't, but I still have a lot of like questions and problems with what the game ultimately is. So let's talk about, hold on, let me look this up. Jericho, that's his name. We're going to call him BB-8, because, look at him. It's fucking BB-8. So he shows up at the very start of Age of Calamity, and he's the main thing that you'll notice is different from Breath of the Wild. New character, and the idea behind him is that he can time travel. That's right, he's the most important character of the entire Zelda franchise. The idea behind him is it's BB-8, and he's cute, and oh, isn't that cute that he's there? And Zelda built him when she was young and like studying Guardians and stuff. She built him with her mother, so she has like this emotional connection to him. We don't ever see her mother in this game, even though we know that she died at some point, but we're not allowed to see what she looked like or any of that, or any of their interactions together, which might have informed this whole backstory that you give this new character that now exists. So he can time travel, and so he time travels from the Breath of the Wild timeline, I think, from when the Hyrule's getting destroyed, back in time to the start of Age of Calamity, so he can change the timeline so that they don't lose. And you're supposed to just get emotionally invested in BB-8 because he's cute and he looks like BB-8 and he plays Zelda's Lullaby. Remember Zelda's Lullaby from Ocarina of Time? I do, because I played Ocarina of Time, but it hasn't been a thing in Breath of the Wild yet. Until now.
It was a cheap move.
I hate to agree with The Last Jedi over here, but like, yeah, that's a cheap move, okay? Obviously, I'm gonna feel something when I hear Zelda's Lullaby, but that's because I played Ocarina. It's not because of this game. If you want to actually properly get me invested in this character, then fucking show her mom. Later on in the game, he warps fucking Sidon and the bird guy and Yunobo and all those guys to this timeline from over here. They like remember you. And the one kind of interesting thing about that is that like Sidon and Mipha get to like talk. And that's kind of cool because she died and he's sad about that. And he wanted to like live up to her legacy and all that stuff. That's like kind of interesting, but they barely spend any time on it because it's just like moving on. It's like, what do you mean moving on? They're fucking time traveled from another timeline, I guess, and they're just here now, and it's just like, oh, I guess we're along for the ride. And I'm like, what the fuck is happening? What is any of this? And then they just kind of like win, and then that's the game. And it's like, but like, what the hell happened? Explain any of your shit. Explain how this crazy time travel works. Why is this just another timeline and you barely addressed it? And then at the end, all the characters from the future, from Breath of the Wild, are just like, oh, we're going back to our own time now. But it's like, are they? Or are they just like fading from existence because you've irrecoverably altered history? Explain what the hell is happening in this game. Now, I'm not asking for like a big exposition scene where someone brings out the chalkboard and explains how time travel works. I think I more just want to know what the stakes are. Something more like this scene from Star Trek 2009.
And then the logical thing is to be unpredictable.
You are assuming that Nero knows how events are predicted to unfold. The contrary, Nero's very presence has altered the flow of history, beginning with the attack on the USS Kelvin, culminating in the events of today, thereby creating an entire new chain of incidents that cannot be anticipated by either party.
An alternate reality.
Something where the characters are like, well, in my timeline, you died, so we don't know what is going to happen. And the game kind of has this attitude about not really establishing its world very well throughout.
None of this makes any sense.
There's this bad guy. His name is Aster. And at first I'm like, oh, well, who the fuck is this guy? Is he Vati? That would be interesting. Vati was like from way earlier. That was just my guess. And then they just kind of like don't explain who he is or where he comes from or any of that. And it's like, what? Who the fuck was that? Is he just a Girahim type? Just a guy who's like, I'm gonna resurrect Ganon. But like, what's his backstory? Where did he come from? Why is he here? Why does he know about the future? What's his deal? Is he related to Vati somehow? Who is he? And they just never explain it. There's this whole subplot that they set up with Mipha and Daruk, where she's like, hey Daruk, could I like train with you? Because I have a crush on Link and I kind of want to impress him. And he's like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. And then they just never follow up on that. There's like a million side missions and none of them are Mipha and Daruk training together. Like, I just want to see these characters interact and develop, and they just never give you that. They just, like, don't. I feel like we learned more about them in the Breath of the Wild DLC, which had, like, 3 cutscenes, and that's it. Like, I shouldn't really be upset about any of this. Like, as soon as the game, like, starts to get going, like, we start to see these characters get, like, brought together for this cool, epic quest, it's like, nope, never mind. Fucking Teba is here. Hooray, and time travel and shit, but we're barely going to talk about that. Moving on, we got to do this other stuff, and then win the game, and then it's over. And it's like, what? Oh yeah, Tarek, fucking BB-8 dies at the end and, like, sacrifices himself, and it's like, I wish I gave a shit about any of this, but I don't even know what's happening at this point, and you just refuse to explain it, and you refuse to develop the characters that are on the box. There's supposed to be this, like, emotional moment at the end when the new champions are saying goodbye because they're, like, warping back. Mipha and Sidon have, like, a nice moment because they're brother and sister, and then Daruk and Urbosa have the same moment to their, like, counterparts, which is just like, I'm proud of you, and they're like, thanks, that means a lot, and then they move on. And then Teba, who's a nothing character, and Rivali, who's just an asshole, are just like, see ya. It's like, wow, your chance to, like, I don't know, maybe develop Teba as a character since he's nothing. And all the other ones that you meet in Breath of the Wild, like, they have, like, a thing, or you have to, like, help them out with something, and then they're like, all right, well, I'll help you out with something, you know, like a video game. But then, like, when you go meet Teba, you're like, hey, do you want to help me fight this big bird thing? And he's like, yeah, okay. And that's it. That's this whole scene. And then in this game, they continue to do nothing with him. And it's like, all right, why don't they just have, like, voiceover dialogue during the actual gameplay, like how almost every other modern game does. I know voice acting is still kind of new for Nintendo at this point. The game already has all these like little prompts come up from dialogue from the characters during the battles and stuff. I can't read that while I'm focusing on everything else happening on screen. So like any interaction they could really have, like, isn't voice acted or anything. I'm not asking for like a crazy amount of extra voice work here, because there's like probably a couple hundred like side missions that also have like these dialogue boxes come up and stuff. I don't really care about those. But why not just have the dialogue in the actual main campaign levels like voice acted? It could also be like useful too, because like I'm not really focusing on that while I'm fighting all these other things and stuff. To have them say things like, oh, this outpost is under attack, we need reinforcements, or oh, you have to go over here now to fight this guy. That might be useful to just have the character say, so that you like are aware of what the next step in the level is. But like, nah, they don't do any of that. And that'd make a great opportunity to have like more of these interactions between these different characters that you've set up to have like arcs and stuff, and then they just don't follow through. I don't know if I can be too upset with Nintendo here, because their priority is gameplay, which I think is smart. The series is also a completely different development team, and so they're doing their own thing. Like, that's fine. It is this like spin-off thing. It's not really the same as like a main series Zelda game. But at the same time, it's kind of frustrating, because Zelda has these great characters in this really, really cool fantasy world. And yes, the timeline is convoluted as fuck, and sometimes they don't really care about it. Sometimes it's best to just kind of ignore it altogether and treat each game like it's its own thing. But at the same time, I kind of like some of this stuff, and I like the story. I like Skyward Sword, because the story is interesting. It has one of the best versions of Zelda in any of them. And it has like fun side characters that go through like character arcs and stuff. I know it likes this game because it has motion control. They keep seeming to take these like half steps toward like telling a cool, interesting, fun story in the Zelda franchise, but then they take these steps back from it too. It's like, should I care about this? Should I care about these characters? Do you want me to get invested in this? Because you don't seem to be that invested in what's happening. You don't even want to fully flesh out the backstory of your biggest Zelda game. Now, again, maybe I'm criticizing the game for something that it's not, but I really wish they had spent some more time on the Link and Zelda relationship. I don't need to see them kiss or anything, but in Breath of the Wild, they set up this interesting dynamic where Zelda doesn't really like Link at first, because he's like automatically good at everything, and she has to like struggle to unlock her secret magic power or whatever. But then over time, she starts to grow to appreciate him and how courageous he is and all that nonsense. But it's not something we ever really get to see unfold, even in this game. Which is weird for a game that seems to want to focus on Zelda as a character. I just think it would be cool if there was a game where Link and Zelda went on a fun adventure together, which is something we've never really gotten in the series before. The teaser for Breath of the Wild 2 shows Link and Zelda exploring this dungeon together, and I want to see that game. I want to see that story. The story that's been teased since the early Breath of the Wild trailers. But I'm worried that Nintendo is just going to have Zelda get kidnapped again in like the first hour of the game, and then you have to rescue her, and it's just like every other Zelda game. It just feels like whenever Nintendo has a chance to tell a compelling Zelda story with like character development, they just slap time travel on it and call it a day. In the endgame of Age of Calamity, there's a bunch of bonus missions, and if you do enough of them and collect certain items and stuff, you can rebuild BB-8, and you get one more cutscene with all the characters where they're like, hey, we fixed him, he's good. And then you can play as him, which is kind of cool, but at the same time, I would just kind of like more from this thing. You have all these fun, interesting characters, and they all play very uniquely and really fun and stuff, and I liked playing this game. I sunk a lot of hours into it. I really like the sense of progression you get. They take a lot of elements from Breath of the Wild where there's like a zillion items that you collect, but they all feel important and useful and help your sense of progression. Part of me wants to just like 100% complete this game to just try to get more out of these characters in this story. But I doubt that you really get anything rewarding for doing that. So I don't know. This was another long and convoluted video where I make where I talk about a lot of things that I care deeply about, but probably make very little sense in the end. At the end of the day, I really, really like Zelda, and I did enjoy Age of Calamity, but at the same time, I just kind of would like, for once, for Nintendo to care about the storyline of this series as much as the fans do. I'm really curious and excited for Breath of the Wild 2, whenever that ends up coming out. And I think it would be interesting and cool to see more of a storyline and have more interesting things to do with these characters and stuff. But I'm kind of worried that they're just going to be like, nah, never mind, we don't care. And it's a little bit frustrating because I like this series and these characters and I want to learn more and get invested in them. But when Nintendo is like, nah, don't worry about it, it doesn't matter, it's kind of like, then why should I care about any of it, you know? Anyways, that's all for now. Have you played Zeldas? Have you played Age of Calamity? What did you think? Comment below. Who's your main character? I'm maining Urbosa, of course. Come on, look at her. She's beautiful. Like and subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll talk about something else on the next time. See ya.